Welcome, genre fans! In this episode, we will be exploring one of the major collaborators who contributed to the genre, or Fione in Italian, called Giallo, Dario Argento. While we are dividing these next videos up by director, we do recognize the challenges and limitations of auteur theory. Directors frequently receive all credit for their films, when in fact it is a collaborative medium, involving dozens to thousands of cast and crew members to make each film. This era of Italian filmmaking was on a tight enough timeline, with movies taking as little as 4 weeks to shoot and directors credited for multiple films per year, that we do believe Giallo directors had a higher impact on each movie. But dividing discussion up by director remains a shortcut, and we acknowledge and will endeavor to include the work of collaborators such as writers, composers, cinematographers, editors, actors, etc. Dario Argento is one of the most instantly recognizable figures in the Giallo canon. He reinvigorated the genre with his so-called Animal trilogy, starting in 1970 with The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and ending the boom period in 1975 with his magnum opus, Deep Red. Argento popularized representative Giallo tropes and heightened them through the lens of his own visual experimentation and deepest fears. Dario was born on September 7, 1940. Family collaboration played a key role throughout Argento's career. His father, Salvatore, was a famous film executive and producer. His mother, Elda Luxardo, was a Brazilian commercial photographer. His younger brother, Claudio, produced the majority of Dario's most influential films, as well as co-producing George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Claudio also co-wrote and produced Alejandro Jodorowsky's Santa Sangre. An emaciated, melancholy child, Dario was a loner who sought solace in forbidden books, particularly the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Morbid fantasy was part of his developing mind, and his interest in film stemmed from the experience of seeing The Phantom of the Opera starring Claude Rains as a child. He was an avid cinephile in his teenage years. Somewhat driftless, Argento opted for a career in journalism rather than a university education. At Paese di Sera, he would become a film critic and gain connections to Rome's intelligentsia and the Italian filmmaking community. Along with newcomer Bernardo Bertolucci, Argento became a screenwriter and worked most prominently with Sergio Leone on Once Upon a Time in the West. But it was Salvatore who provided Dario with his first opportunity to direct. He produced Dario's first film, a giallo called The Bird with a Crystal Plumage. Its international triumph cemented Dario's auteur status and launched his long career. Dario Argento is the most prolific director in the Giallo canon, making 13 total as of 2022. While his lasting impact is with supernatural horror Suspiria, his contributions to Giallo cannot be understated. He is the sole director in the series who never gave up on the subgenre, directing gialli into the 80s and 90s. Let's get into those films. The first film in Dario Argento's Animal trilogy is The Bird with a Crystal Plumage. Aside from popularizing the genre, this film is remarkable as being photographed by Oscar-winning cinematographer Vittorio Storaro. Based on Frederick Brown's novel The Screaming Mimi, The Bird with a Crystal Plumage centers on an American expatriate in Rome, Sam Dalmas, witnessing an attempted murder that is connected to an ongoing killing spree. Despite the danger to himself and his girlfriend Julia, he helps Inspector Morosini investigate. With this film, Argento popularized several giallo tropes established by Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, and continued through Umberto Lenzi's late 60s gialli and others such as Romolo Guerrieri's The Sweet Body of Deborah and Giulio Questi's Death Laid an Egg. Argento dramatizes an amateur sleuth in a foreign country suddenly embroiled in a string of murders, much like the protagonist of Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much. There is a strong police procedural element with the Inspector Morosini character, well-tread ground in the giallo subgenre. Though pitted against each other at first, Sam and Morosini conduct parallel cooperative investigations. Morosini overshares confidential police data, brings Sam to lineups, wiretaps his phone, and brings him on a tour of the latest forensic equipment. In this scene, Morosini shows Sam a giant sound analysis computer equipped to interpret background noises on phone calls. Bava originated the Giallo killer as a shadowy, mysterious figure wearing a hat, trench coat, mask, and gloves in blood and black lace, an evolution of the trench coat and hat-wearing villain lurking in the shadows in noir and crimi films. Argento nearly replicates that here. Whereas Giallo killers had used a variety of weapons in previous films, Argento's preferred choice is blades, especially a straight razor. The killer revealed to be a woman driven by past drama is another Giallo convention Argento expanded upon. Monica Ranieri sees a painting depicting a brutal attack from her adolescence by chance, and the painting triggers her madness. Taking on the persona of the man who attacked her, she kills several people. When Monica steps out of the shadows and reveals herself to be the killer in the climactic scene, she laughs like a sadistic child. In her struggle with Sam, she adds her weight to the grotesque spike statue pinning him, and taunts him while stabbing his hands. The psycho-style exposition delivered by a televised psychiatrist in the final scene explains that Monica's husband Albert was her accomplice, shielding her from detection. Monica herself is deemed incurably mad. While there were stylized, sexualized killings in 60s gialli, Argento escalated the sadism of the killer. In one scene, the killer viciously torments a woman in bed, running a straight razor along her negligee-clad body and tearing her underwear. Argento is known for sound, and we can see the beginning both of later soundscapes and the use of jarring sound effects. Ennio Morricone contributed a standard giallo score for The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. But silence is also used for emphasis. Here, the tension builds and the gunshot from an assassin tracking Sam feels more violent. And here, Monica's loud razor movements emphasize her violent intent. Perhaps the biggest giallo element introduced in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is killer POV. Here at the horse race, the killer looks through binoculars at the next victim. Here, the killer stalks another victim through the park. Another notable instance is the killer creeping through the destroyed courtyard of Sam's soon-to-be demolished apartment building on a mission to torment Julia. Hinting at Argento's varied use of POV beyond killers in the 80s, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage also has a see through the victim's eyes. Argento also intensified murders to sudden, hyper-stylized attacks that became a staple of the Theone in the early 70s. Here, the killer suddenly appears from the mist to swing a huge blade at Sam. In another scene, the killer corners the next victim in an elevator. We see the disguised killer from the victim's point of view, furiously slashing uncomfortably close to her face. Argento used Hitchcock-style comic relief with side characters. This pimp is a false suspect who stutters and generally muses Sam. In another scene, Sam gets key background information about the killer from painter Berto Consalvi. He is extremely eccentric, walling himself into a crumbling house and eating cats for sustenance. The nod to Hitchcock is more explicit in Argento's casting of Reggie Nalder, the assassin from The Man Who Knew Too Much. Sam follows the assassin, who is wearing a yellow jacket, into a convention hall full of men wearing the same distinct costume, in a very Hitchcockian visual gag. One recurring theme Argento would return to in later works is the world of dreams seeping into reality, or supplanting it entirely. He writes of wanting Sam to walk the streets of a nondescript Rome in a dreamlike state and get caught in a modernist structure of glass and concrete. We see this in the centerpiece scene of Sam witnessing Monica's struggle with Albert, trapping him between two glass panels like a caged animal, helpless and impotent, a prisoner of his own nightmare. Vertiginous hallucinatory works of art play a prominent role in the hyper-modern world of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Argento continued to use grotesque paintings and fetishized objects in nearly all of his subsequent gialli. Here, Argento places brutalist sculptures that evoke both medieval iconography and torture devices in the gallery space. They are like manifestations of nightmares, foreshadowing the killer's identity and literally trapping Sam in the finale. The Bird with the Crystal Plumage displays portrays many personal elements that would shape the genre and portend the thematic preoccupations in Argento's subsequent works, namely his fears about his vision or memory not reflecting reality. If we consider the actor as stand-in for the director, and as a creative like many other Argento protagonists, Sam can be read as Dario in this film. He misinterprets what he sees. He thinks he witnesses the killer attacking Monica, whereas it was the deranged Monica attacking her gloved, trench-coated husband. Argento would return to this near-fatal misremembrance in Deep Red, where protagonist Marcus sees the murderer reflected in a mirror in one of the very first scenes, but cannot recollect it until the end. The Cat o' Nine Tails is the second movie in Argento's Animal trilogy, and the most standard giallo of the three. It is also famously Argento's least favorite of all his filmography. A blackmail threat is overheard by a blind former journalist, Franco "Cookie" Arnaud, and his young ward Lori. The same night, a guard is attacked during a theft at the Genetic Engineering Institute next door. As more people connected with the Terzi Institute are killed by a gloved figure, journalist Carlo Giordani joins Cookie to investigate. This follow-up to The Bird with the Crystal Plumage has a relentlessly convoluted plot involving industrial espionage and some questionable eugenics-adjacent research. We find out that the Terzi Institute has discovered that certain people have an extra Y chromosome that indicates a propensity for violence and criminal behavior. Cookie, played by Hollywood veteran Carl Malden, is an ex-reporter who now spends his days inventing crossword puzzles and taking care of his niece. His lack of sight heightens his intuition. He instructs Lori to look at the blackmailer while pretending to tie his shoe. He suggests that Carlo enlarge the picture with the near imperceptible detail of the murderer's hands, and he pieces together that the killer's identity is hidden in a locket. Cookie and Carlo make a great team, with Cookie on intellectual labor and Carlo in the field, a duo that we'll see again with Marcus and Gianna in Deep Red. Cookie and Carlo quickly realize they must investigate the scientists and executives at the Terzi Institute, of which there are 9, hence the title, The Cat o' Nine Tails.
Un gatto con 9 code.
Carlo investigates this cast of characters, having a brief fling with the Institute director's daughter, Anna. In one scene, the killer poisons a packet of milk, which Carlo and Anna nearly drink. Anna gives Carlo critical information, explaining the XYY research and its implications, setting him on the trail of several Terzi staff members. The killer design is standard giallo fare, black leather gloves and a trench coat. We see from the killer's POV in many scenes, like when he breaks into the Terzi Institute to steal what we will come to know as the cutting-edge criminal gene research. As in many gialli, there is an array of shady characters with motive for both the initial robbery and subsequent murders. The killer strangles the newspaper's photographer with a garrote and steals the negatives. The blackmailer's widow, Bianca, discovers the identity of the killer from a piece of paper in her dead husband's car and hides the solution in a locket. It doesn't take long for the killer to dispatch her. As in the majority of his gialli, Argento has a queer supporting character. Carlo questions one of the Terzi scientists, Braun, after tracing him to a gay bar, which is the definition of a relic of its time. As we see with the antique dealer in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage and the private investigator in 4 Flies on Grey Velvet, queer characters make the protagonist either mildly uncomfortable or slightly amused. Argento's preoccupation with sight is definitely present here. The Cat o' Nine Tails elaborates on the central trope of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Cookie is a foil to Sam Dalmas, the hero who misinterprets what he has seen. Cookie is a blind man, yet he's the most capable of insight and collaboration. Where Carlo misses a key detail within the bigger picture, Cookie directs him to look closer. Argento uses disconcerting camera work, back and forth cutting rather than traditional zooms or other techniques, to make the point that the act of observation is inherently flawed. Argento taunts us by putting one of the killer's eyes in close-up so that we cannot identify them, despite the uniqueness of the human iris. The close-up divorces it from context clues like gender or skin tone. 4 Flies on Grey Velvet is the final film of Dario Argento's Animal trilogy, and the one that begins to include the supernatural influence he'd use in later films. It inaugurated the start of Argento's visionary horror phase. Drummer Roberto Tobias follows the man who has been trailing him and is photographed accidentally killing the man in an abandoned theater by a sinister figure wearing a children's mask. Roberto can't go to the police, so returns home where he and his wife Nina start to receive threatening notes and phone calls, but without any blackmail demands. When more people close to the couple are murdered by a mysterious killer, Roberto must figure out who is tormenting them. Like The Bird with the Crystal Plumage and The Cat o' Nine Tails, Four Flies on Grey Velvet uses killer POV. Here, the killer chases the Tobias' maid Amelia between buildings as she attempts to escape the killer. In this film, it is not just to build tension, but to lend immediacy to the violence of actual murders. Here is the killer talking to the man they had paid to act as murder victim, so Roberto could be framed. We can see the brass object in the foreground as the killer beats him before finding a wire to use as a garrote to kill him. There is also killer POV for the murder of private investigator Gianni Arosio, as the killer lures him off a subway train and into a bathroom to inject him with poison that kills him. Finally, there is a POV with another murder weapon, this time a knife, when the killer has sliced Dahlia and stabs her to death. As in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, the killer is ultimately revealed to be a woman, in this case, Nina. She acts from a place of trauma, having been raised as a boy by a domineering father who wanted a masculine heir to his fortune. Flashbacks reveal Nina's father committed her to an asylum, as he had previously done to her mother. His voice berating Nina for being too feminine can be heard over these flashbacks.
Imbecille! Si deve mai piangere.
Nina in fact marries Roberto because he reminds her of her father, who died before she could enact her plan to kill him as vengeance for his abuse of her and her mother. This is psychosexual confusion and violence brought on by childhood trauma, a common Argento theme. Argento returns again to comic relief to lighten the atmosphere of tension. None of it works in this film. Roberto enlists a couple of unhoused eccentrics living in shacks by the river. One is Diomedes, or Dio for short, which translates to God in Italian. God has a parrot with a name translating to fuck you, and is accompanied by the professor, a man with a Bible verse for every occasion. Roberto also mistakes a postal worker for the blackmailer and attacks him, resulting in the postman comically avoiding Roberto a couple of times later in the film. There is also a gay character, private investigator Gianni Arosio, who is meant to provide comic relief. As with the Braun character in The Cat o' Nine Tails, Gianni is not ultimately vilified for her sexuality. However, to modern audiences, the characterization of a flamboyant, limp-wristed man who walks arm in arm with Roberto and calls him dear is, at best, stereotyping that will seem very dated indeed. Thankfully, this does not lessen the pathos of his death scene. Gianni dies having correctly identified the killer and solved the crime.
Stavolta c'ero riuscito. Che colpo avevo fatto?
A giallo element that Argento heightens is moving the modern setting into a modernist, or even near-future one. The titular four flies are revealed in a scene involving science fiction. Victim Dahlia's eyeball contains an imprint of her last sight, which can be recreated in a police lab. Presciently in the climactic confrontation scene, a round fired by Nina is shown in slow motion. Argento would improve this shot in opera, and we would see it imitated in futuristic action movie The Matrix. Four Flies on Grey Velvet has an unconventional Argentine soundscape focusing on contemporary prog rock music cleverly provided by Roberto's band. This contrasts the long stretches of silence that accompany virtually all character interaction, creating realism and intimacy. To build tension before the final showdown, Argento returns to Roberto's drum solo before cutting all but the eerie Kurosawa-esque sound of wind as Roberto waits in his darkened home for the killer. Finally, when Nina approaches her death in slow motion, it is overlaid with the la 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 vocalization Ennio Morricone added to many other giallo scores. This film, more than the other two in the Animal trilogy, feels Argentian. This is both in aesthetic and theme. Argento is exploring his own fears and fixations. There is an extremely strong component of dreams, nightmares really, being actual precognition. Roberto has a recurring nightmare of a beheading. He believes it is his own, but in the final scene we learn that it is Nina's decapitation. Where this scene makes horrific final moments almost beautiful, there are two scenes where reality becomes nightmarish. The first is when Amelia suddenly realizes everyone has left the park and she is locked in. It could not be dark so soon, giving the scene a surreal feel. This is heightened when Amelia is being chased by the killer and starts down what seems like a normal alley, but narrows as if from a dream perspective. Gianni experiences a similar sudden departure from reality when he follows the killer to a subway station, and the crowd abruptly clears out, leaving a nightmarish silence and a whispering killer baiting him to his death. Deep Red is the capstone of the Giallo boom period for film audiences and critics alike. Many consider it to be both Argento's most representative Giallo and a bridge between his Animal trilogy and his most famous film, supernatural horror Suspiria. After Helga Ullmann senses an evil presence at the parapsychology conference where she is guest speaker, a trench-coated, gloved killer breaks into her apartment to brutally murder her. On the street below, jazz pianist Marcus Daly witnesses the scene and runs up too late. He investigates with plucky reporter Gianna as more killings accumulate, and he himself is terrorized by the murderer. As in Argento's own Cat o' Nine Tails or other Fiona fare such as What Have You Done to Solange or Short Night for Glass Dolls, there are two amateur sleuths, Englishman abroad Marcus and local reporter Gianna. Marcus is played by blow-ups David Hemmings, and Gianna is Dario Argento, Argento's partner and muse at the time. Gianna, rather than being the throwaway love interest, is a fiery reporter who chases stories, pulls Marcus out of the house of the screaming child, and helps him unmask the killer. The two have an excellent rapport, and it's delightful to watch them together.
Ancora un po' e finivi arrosto come un pollo.
Immediately, Argento thrusts us into the unnerving psyche of the deranged killer. Killer POV marries form and content, leading the audience into a dizzying atmosphere of near supernatural violence. We follow the killer as she retreats to the bathroom, then stalks Helga in the empty theater. Those hallmarks of a Giallo killer, the trench, gloves, and hat, are on full display during the murders of Helga and author Amanda Righetti. Argento insisted on playing the killer himself during all of the murder scenes. Unusually for Giallo, the killings are not sexualized, so the audience is immediately led to believe the murderer is either a gay man or a straight woman. Marcus's musician friend Carlo is codified as queer and is thus immediately the prime suspect. Argento uses queer characters often, as in this lineup scene, or the gay-coded antique store proprietor who called one victim a lesbian, both in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. In Deep Red, Marcus tracks Carlo to lover Massimo Ricci's house. Massimo is played by Geraldine Hopper, wearing a fake mustache, as if Argento wanted Carlo to have a hyper-feminine boyfriend. In a scene interrupting the opening credits, a knife is dropped next to a child's buckled shoes, leading us to believe this child is the killer. The child's gender is not initially clear. Marcus uncovers childhood paintings of the murder in the house of the screaming child, and Marcus and Gianna find violent drawings in the elementary school. This affirms Carlo as both the child of the house of the screaming child and their prime suspect in the killings. Argento mercilessly kills Carlo in an extended scene where he is dragged behind a truck and his face obliterated by an oncoming car. Marcus realizes that Carlo couldn't have committed the murders only after he is killed. In the end, it is revealed that Carlo witnessed his mother Marta kill his father on Christmas morning because she didn't want to go back to the mental asylum. She is a traumatized woman driven to madness, stalking Marcus in his apartment and tormenting him with whispered death threats. She is infantilized as if stunted by the primary act of murder that opens the film, keeping a treasure trove of children's toys, playing a childhood melody on a portable tape player, and even setting a demented puppet designed by Oscar winner Carlo Rambaldi against psychiatrist Giordani. It is a Freudian return of the repressed. Argento creates an environment of extreme artifice in Deep Red. The film begins with a series of red velvet curtains opening into a luscious scarlet theater where a parapsychology conference is underway. Marcus runs into his friend Carlo in front of a cafe modeled after Edward Hopper's famed 1942 painting Nighthawks, the customers modeled like painterly mannequins. Argento cast legendary film actress Clara Calamai to play the killer. You might recognize her from our brief discussion of Luchino Visconti's Assassione and our socio-historical context of Giallo video, linked in cards. Argento shot the majority of the film in Turin, one of the Golden Triangle cities of post-war miracle, because it resembles a minimalist, modern soundstage. The characters are more dimensional than in most gialli, their psyches fractured and obsessive. An extreme close-up shows a collection of children's trinkets against a black background before a jarring close-up of the killer's eye as she applies thick raccoon-like eyeliner. When Marcus uncovers Carlo's painting of murder at the house of the screaming child, it adds a perverse layer of characterization to Marta's psyche. She has hidden her true nature, and discovering it contaminates Marcus. In the final shot, he stares helpless and hopeless into the pool of blood Marta has left behind. As with the Animal Trilogy protagonist, an Argentine preoccupation with sight manifests in Marcus. He is spurred to a quest for truth because he feels he missed a detail of the crime scene. Marta had been hiding in plain sight amidst the gallery of grotesque paintings in Helga's apartment. Marcus had seen her face reflected in a mirror whose ornate frame was similar to that of the paintings. Deep Red's score is florid like other gialli, but shows Argento's strong modern bent. Unhappy with jazz musician Giorgio Gaslini's score, Argento pivoted to prog rock alternatives. He wanted Pink Floyd, then Deep Purple, but his Cinevox connection Carlo Bixio suggested a band named Oliver. Argento was impressed with frontman Claudio Simonetti, so the group signed on, changing their name to Goblin. This would be an extremely fruitful partnership, with Goblin doing soundtracks for Suspiria, Tenebrae, Phenomena, and many other Argento films. For Deep Red, Argento provided Goblin reference points, the work of band Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Mike Oldfield's score from The Exorcist, Tubular Bells. Argento leans into the existence of the supernatural in this film, a move that would influence his career direction in future gialli. Helga really did read the thoughts of the killer at the parapsychology conference. Argento foreshadows Marta's death like premonitions in several scenes. Helga dribbles water from her mouth like Marta foams at the mouth in her death scene. Marcus pulls the chain at the gate of the house of the screaming child, visually referencing Marta's necklace being caught in the elevator that will behead her. Amanda touches the doll in the noose and its head falls off, auguring Marta's decapitation. Tenebrae is a return to Giallo for Dario Argento after supernatural horror masterpiece Suspiria and the more poorly received Inferno. It can be read as Argento's metafictional reaction to criticisms of misogyny in his own work, in addition to exploring more familiar pet themes. Peter Neal, in Rome promoting his newest murder mystery novel Tenebrae, is embroiled in the investigation of a serial killer imitating the murders in his works of fiction. In the Giallo tradition, Peter is an American abroad looking into killings simultaneously with the police, in this case a pair of detectives, Inspector Germani, who is a fan of murder mystery novels himself, and woman detective Altieri. They're on the scene questioning Peter as soon as he gets to his apartment, and seek his cooperation throughout the film. They are modern police, balancing forensics with old-fashioned detective work. At a victim's autopsy, they question the medical examiner. Detective Germani quotes the classic Sherlock Holmes line,
"When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth."
He cites his favorite detective fiction.
You know something? I read all of those books. Agatha Christie, Mickey Spillane, Rex Stout, Egmont Payne. And I'm a detective, right?
Including Peter's novels, to establish a rapport. In true Giallo form, Tenebrae has stylized, sexualized killings. Like Bava's A Bay of Blood, there are multiple killers who slaughter the other characters one by one. First victim Elsa is slashed by a glove killer who stuffs pages of Peter's book Tenebrae into her mouth. The second and third victims are reporter Tilda and her girlfriend Marion, who the killer massacres with a razor in an extended sequence of sexualized violence. Marion's corpse lying bloody in the stairwell, her breast exposed, is one of the film's most iconic images. The killer's fourth victim is Peter's apartment superintendent's daughter Maria, who is forced into the killer's lair by an attack dog. He executes her with a hatchet. The film pivots to the second killer, Peter himself, who dispatches the first killer, Cristiano, with a hatchet to the head, while Peter's driver, Gianni, watches. He kills Balmer in a busy public setting, stabbing him in the gut and walking away as if a passerby. Peter kills Gianni, who has pieced together the identity of Cristiano's killer, by garroting him in his car. Peter kills ex-fiancée Jane with a hatchet, chopping off her hand in spectacular fashion. Detective Altieri follows a lead from Bulmer's housekeeper to Jane's apartment, only for Peter to slay her with his hatchet. In a flashback, Peter's POV shows him killing a girl in red shoes by stabbing her in the abdomen. When Germani and Anne arrive at Jane's apartment, they find Peter bloody and rocking back and forth in the corner. To evade capture, Peter slits his throat with a prop blade. After securing Anne in his car, Germani returns to the apartment where Peter kills him with an axe to the back. Anne follows Germani back into the house, only to accidentally impale Peter with a modernist sculpture. Argento bungles the queer characters again in Tenebrae. Journalist Tilda is depicted as an angry feminist who confronts Peter with charges of misogyny in his books, echoing the criticisms feminists levied at Argento in his press tour for Suspiria in America. Tilda's relationship with girlfriend Marion is wholly unconvincing. The first killer, reporter Cristiano Berti, has a standard giallo design. He wears leather gloves and wields a razor. For Maria's POV, we see him in the shadows wearing a mask and trench. She discovers his office where he keeps complete files of all his victims with corpse pictures and newspaper clippings. He is sadistic in nature, taunting Peter with whispered death threats and notes made of cut-out letters. As the second killer, Peter wears a trench and gloves when he kills Balmer, but we see him openly in the finale. Like Cristiano, he's a sadist with killer POV. As in the Cat o' Nine Tails, Argento shows extreme close-ups of Peter's eye before he kills. He evades detection after killing Cristiano off-screen by making it appear to Gianni that he got hit on the head with a stone. Argento returns again to the trope of sight. After witnessing Cristiano's murder at the hands of an off-screen killer, Gianni returns to Cristiano's mansion with a nagging suspicion reminiscent of Sam Dalmas in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Marcus Daly in Deep Red. Gianni suddenly remembers that when he heard Cristiano saying,
I killed them all. Cristiano. But I killed them all! He was the murderer. So...
he was actually witnessing Cristiano's confession. Peter's psychosexual urges to kill are again shown to be a result of past trauma. Germani explains to Anne that Peter had been suspected of killing a girl during his youth in Vermont. Throughout Tenebrae, Peter relives the past in dreamlike flashbacks. He sends Jane a pair of red shoes echoing those worn by the girl on the beach, which she had used to humiliate him. Both the way these flashbacks are shot and the way Peter is shown taking pills prior to them sow doubt about whether they are memories, dreams, or the sexual fantasies of a murderer. Argento harkens back to the modernist cityscape of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, intentionally avoiding Roman landmarks in favor of neo-future settings sparsely populated by rich people. Cristiano, Tilda, and Marion live in huge modernist mansions. In a long take, Argento uses a Lumicrane from lurking killer POV as Cristiano prowls outside of Tilda and Marion's window to the roof and second floor windows and back down again, the futuristic Goblin score playing at full force. In opera, Argento continues the metafictional and childhood trauma elements of Tenebrae and returns to his obsessions with dreams and the act of observation. Young understudy soprano Betty takes the lead role in iconoclast horror director Marco Bedini's avant-garde staging of Verdi's Macbeth, only to find herself stalked and tormented by a hooded figure she dreamed of as a child, who attaches a needle torture device to her eyes so she must watch his murders. Some of the most obvious giallo elements surround the killer, Alan, who wears black gloves, a trench coat, and a mask. Rather than the typical separate fedora and mask, Alan wears a black hood which, but for color, evokes the killer in Sergio Martino's 1973 Giallo Torso, or Charles B. Pierce's 1976 slasher, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. There is extensive killer POV to show hyper-violent stylized murders. Here we see from Alan's perspective as he murders Betty's boyfriend while forcing her to watch. Here we observe him killing stage manager Julia. We also at several points see through the killer's eyes as he stalks victims. Alan's psychosexual urge to murder arises from past abuse at the hands of Betty's mother, who made him torture and kill people before she would allow him to engage with her sexually. He is unhinged, fixated on replicating the relationship he had with Betty's mother, with Betty. Betty is the victim who also acts from past trauma. As a child, she witnessed her mother's twisted games with Alan and dreams of them again and again. This impedes her waking life in the form of sexual dysfunction. She cannot make love to her boyfriend, nor to new love interest, director Marco. This through line of her simultaneous desire and inability to be sexually intimate to the sublimation of sexual desire with violence goes back to Hitchcock. Ultimately, the sexualized violence Betty has witnessed contaminates her. In the end, she falls to the ground, renouncing the human race entirely. The past resurfaces in many forms. Betty plays Lady Macbeth as her opera singer mother had while she was alive. Betty's neighbor has a daughter who she berates, echoing Betty's own childhood with her cruel mother. Objects like the golden bracelet engraved with an anniversary date emerge unexpectedly. The hooded killer from her dreams is in fact a figure from her past. Like Tenebrae, opera is Argento's metafictional commentary on his own position and function as a horror director. Marco is Argento's alter ego, not respected as a horror director, stubborn in his vision, feuding with staff members such as costume designer Julia. The script for opera was initially inspired by Argento's failure to stage a version of Giuseppe Verdi's opera Rigoletto in 1985 that envisioned the titular character as a vampire. Opera is sonically the height of 80s excess. The polarizing score includes Verdi's opera, luminary Brian Eno, frequent Goblin collaborator Claudio Simonetti, and hair metal bands Steel Grave and Northern Light. It is also a visually arresting film. Beginning with the theater reflected in a raven's eye, there is extensive POV beyond just the killer. Scenes are filmed from the perspective of minor characters, such as Mara, the soprano Betty replaces, or Alma, the child of Betty's neighbor. We see through victim Mira's POV as she peers through the eye hole of a door before a bullet spectacularly rips through it as the killer shoots her in the head. Betty has her own POV at several points, as a stand-in for the audience who Argento does not wish to look away during the scary parts. Even the ravens have POV, as they swoop through the crowd to pluck out the eye of the killer sitting in the audience. There are also shots of the killer's brain and blood as he prepares to attack. Argento delves into the realm of the subconscious with dreams and flashbacks. The killer remembers committing murder with Betty's mother. Betty remembers her mother and the killer. It is all very hazy and surreal, intercut with present-day scenes. The audience cannot see the full picture. This is in keeping with Argento's continued exploration of sight. The very premise includes a protagonist forced to watch murders, to not be allowed to flinch or cover her eyes. And yet we also have the eye of the mind through memories that prove unreliable and incomplete. Betty herself is almost killed by Alan impersonating another detective because she has put in eye drops which blur her vision. Her agent Mira is literally shot directly through one eye. Alan ultimately has his eye plucked out by a raven. Even in his work in other genres, Argento used giallo elements. Phenomena is a supernatural film about a young girl, Jennifer, who transfers to a Swiss boarding school where a series of murders has recently taken place. Professor John McGregor studies her ability to telepathically communicate with insects, and together they may be able to solve the crimes. This killer design is classic giallo, with black gloves, trench coat, and a penchant for spectacular murder using blades. Chama is a paranormal slasher filmed in genre fans' hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Aura is a 16-year-old girl with anorexia who escapes from a psychiatric hospital and meets David, who is definitely too old for her. Her capture and return to the hospital coincides with a killer dispatching past and present hospital staff, including Aura's parents, with a portable guillotine that decapitates them. Aura teams up with David to stop the killer. Here we have a giallo killer with black gloves, trench coat, and hat. There is extensive killer POV and stylized gory deaths created by legendary effects artist Tom Savini. Sleepless is a thriller film about a killer copying a string of little person murders that occurred in 1983. Retired detective Ulysses Moretti worked the original case, which ended in the killer dying from a self-inflicted gunshot. He is drawn into the investigation along with now adult Giacomo, whose mother was one of the past victims. In terms of giallo elements, Sleepless includes killer POV and a woman being slapped in the face. While some later Argento films such as The Stendhal Syndrome, The Card Player, or even Giallo are called gialli, they do not include enough genre elements to include here. Many are police procedurals focused on detectives chasing serial killers in the vein of David Fincher's Seven or Joel Schumacher's 8mm. While we don't completely agree with McDonough here, you can see Dario Argento's influence in 80s and 90s horror directed by Lamberto Bava, Michele Soavi, and others. Much of Argento's legacy has been with his supernatural masterpiece Suspiria, rather than his gialli. Of Argento's giallo films, Deep Red inspired the work of his contemporaries. For Halloween, John Carpenter acknowledges the goblin theme as a reference for his own score. Director of Halloween 2, Rick Rosenthal, used a scalding water death similar to this death in Deep Red. In sci-fi classic Scanners, David Cronenberg used the Parapsychology Conference as an inspiration for the iconic head explosion scene. Brian De Palma was inspired by Argento's use of the Lumicrane in Tenebrae in The Untouchables. A scene in Tenebrae where the police inspector is silhouetted with the killer was imitated both by Brian De Palma in Raising Cain and Robert Zemeckis in What Lies Beneath. Asia Argento has said the scene in Tenebrae where Anne, played by her mother Dario Nicolodi, screams repeatedly in horror is the moment that made her want to become an actor. Dario cast Asia in many of his films before she pursued her own career with Scarlet Diva in 2000. Ridley Scott uses the portable guillotine from Trauma in The Counselor. In the giallo revival of the 2010s, Argento's work was evoked by Alain Catet and Bruno Farzani in Amer and The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears. Dario Argento synthesized existing tropes and heightened the aesthetic of giallo by filtering everything through his own thematic obsessions. Despite having many noteworthy gialli, Argento's biggest mark on film is in the realm of supernatural horror. And that's our discussion of Dario Argento's contributions to the giallo subgenre. We'll see you next time to talk Sergio Martino. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and select all so you can know first thing when we post. Don't forget to let your film nerd friends know about our channel. Thanks. See you soon.